Might wanna buckle up, baby.
Punch it, I'm Jacob and welcome to Lightspeed. Although I love them personally, it's no secret that the Star Wars sequel trilogy is pretty divisive when it comes to fan reception. Not just as movies, but as a continuation of both the original and prequel trilogies, respectively. But here's where things get interesting, because what if I told you that The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker are not the only sequel trilogy? Flashback to the early 1990s. After the release of Return of the Jedi in 1983, new Star Wars content became pretty stagnant for the most part. The original trilogy was still beloved by millions, but the hype around the series wasn't as high as it was almost a decade prior. I mean, George Lucas himself also hadn't begun development on the prequel trilogy yet, as the first draft for The Phantom Menace actually wasn't completed until 1993. But while George was considering revisiting the series to look back at what the galaxy was before the Empire, many fans couldn't help but wonder what exactly happened after the events of Return of the Jedi. How would the events of Return of the Jedi affect the galaxy moving forward as a New Republic, and how would that replace a long-standing galactic empire? All of these being questions that would be answered with the help of one man: Timothy Zahn. See, the story group at Lucasfilm was pretty selective about the stories that could be told outside of the Star Wars films. One of the key reasons being that George Lucas himself had always envisioned 9 films for the Star Wars saga. So stories taking place before and after the original trilogy were kind of left untouched, so that George could fill in the gaps with future films or projects if he really wanted to. Stories taking place outside of the movies were ultimately called the Expanded Universe, or the EU for short. And as of 2014, after Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm, are now sold and classified under the Legends banner, because they wanted to make their own sequel trilogy and new continuity. But as it became more apparent that George Lucas had his eyes set on a prequel trilogy, Lucasfilm ultimately granted Timothy Zahn approval to write a continuation of the saga after the events of Return of the Jedi, in which Timothy Zahn didn't just write one book. He actually ended up writing 3. 1991 saw the release of Heir to the Empire, 1992 had the second chapter with Dark Force Rising, and 1993 brought the trilogy to a close with The Last Command, which all went on to gain critical acclaim from fans and critics alike, and selling a combined total of over 15 million copies. The trilogy also helped to bring the expanded universe into the mainstream more than ever before, with Heir to the Empire even reaching #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And they even inspired George Lucas a little bit as well, with the planet Coruscant in this trilogy later making its cinematic debut in Episode 1 and remaining a significant location throughout the entire prequel trilogy. But how does the Thrawn trilogy compare to the sequel trilogy that we ended up getting in the mid to late 2010s? There's a lot of debate as to which trilogy is better, but ultimately I feel like it comes down to your own personal opinion. Yes, both trilogies follow the events of Return of the Jedi, but despite some similarities, I feel like they're almost too different to even compare in the first place. And I know how that sounds, but like, just stay with me. Personally, I feel like both trilogies work well for their respective continuities in a broader overview. The biggest possible difference is the timeline, as the Thrawn trilogy takes place roughly 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, whereas the sequel trilogy takes place a whopping 30 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, resulting in our legacy characters still roughly being around the same ages that they were in the original trilogy in the Thrawn trilogy, and them being much older in canon by the time of the actual sequel trilogy. The Thrawn trilogy mainly revolves around Grand Admiral Thrawn, as he attempts to gain the resources necessary to stop the New Republic before it even really has a chance to begin. All while Luke, Han, Lando, Chewie, and more attempt to find the mysterious Grand Admiral and try to remain one step ahead. And it goes without saying, but Grand Admiral Thrawn is easily one of the best antagonists in all of Star Wars. Timothy Zahn created Thrawn to be more of a stoic, military tactician type rather than another Force-sensitive villain, which makes Thrawn a lot more intriguing right from the start and sets him visually and thematically apart from characters like Darth Vader and the Emperor. I mean, even losses for Thrawn are usually just kind of seen as minor setbacks, and his leadership skills and calculations make him an extremely intense and worthy adversary. There's also this big subplot about Thrawn trying to get these like lizards that can kind of repel the Force like magnets. that doesn't really have to do with anything. I just kind of felt like I needed to mention it because I thought it was kind of cool. However, there's two other antagonists throughout this trilogy that play significant roles. First is Mara Jade, a Force-sensitive user that acted as the Emperor's hand throughout the events of the original trilogy.
As the creator of Mara Jade,
Wait! I am not the creator of Mara Jade, and I want you to get out of this office right now.
I'm sorry, Zeb.
No way.
You brought
No
you brought it on yourself.
I don't want you here.
I'm so sorry, George. I didn't think it would go like this.
She kind of fills in a gap with that missing Force-sensitive antagonist, but it's really her dynamic with Luke Skywalker that adds a lot more emotional weight to her character. I know that it's easy today to point to a multitude of characters that defect from the Empire or the dark side, but at the time, Mara Jade was really one of the first ones. Aside from, like, you know, Darth Vader. The other character is an insane clone of a former Jedi Master, Joruus C'baoth. I really hope that I said that right. I always get confused about how to say that. He's essentially insane and was created by Palpatine on Mount Tantus through a cloning process of Force users. Which, it's pretty cool that this is in this trilogy, as it was kind of our first look at the process of cloning within the Star Wars universe. And if Mount Tantus sounds familiar, you probably recognize it because it was reintroduced in canon in The Bad Batch Seasons 2 and 3. Now, I don't want to spoil too many of the key events and plot elements within this trilogy, as I honestly really recommend reading it for yourself. I read the books in middle school and I thought that they were awesome growing up, and I ended up re-buying the series a couple months ago, and revisiting the books just kind of proved to be a lot of fun. Though I will say that sometimes the amount of knowledge that we have with Star Wars today can kind of contradict certain decisions and elements within this story. It's mainly very subtle things like cloning, the Clone Wars, and the time before the Empire, so it's really not that big of a deal to worry about. But if you put yourself in the mindset of a kid in the early 90s reading these books after watching the original trilogy, I think that they work even better. Again, it's kind of far and few between whenever it comes to elements and situations like that in this story. And if you don't like the sequel trilogy that we got and wondered what it could have been like with our heroes still in their primes, you might find yourself more captivated in this trilogy. Plus, if Zahn does one thing exceptionally well with these stories, it's capturing the feeling of the original trilogy. It really comes down to personal preference, or maybe you enjoy both. Believe it or not, despite what people tell you online, you can. But this is obviously a much different storyline than what we saw beginning in 2015's The Force Awakens. However, I do want to say that although both trilogies are different and distinct enough from one another, they do share some striking similarities, including Luke trying to build a new Jedi Order, Leia and Han being married and eventually having children, a mysterious, seemingly unstoppable fleet that has not been mentioned before that is highly destructive and filled with a bunch of starships, and a massive emphasis on cloning. And I almost forgot to mention, there's also a casino planet. Han and Lando literally go gambling in the middle of like a galaxy-defining situation, and quite honestly, that might be the most in-character thing I've heard for both of them. I guess it's justified because you know what they say, 99% of gamblers quit before they hit big. Again, in execution, the Thrawn trilogy and the sequel trilogy handle these concepts in different ways for the most part. But personally, I find it really cool that a lot of the ideas that the Thrawn trilogy introduced found their way to eventually be reintroduced into the new canon. It's just like Ahsoka says, I mean, there's always some truth in legends. And with Thrawn being a prominent part of Rebels and more recently the Ahsoka series, it's clear that Dave Filoni is planning a big cinematic event inspired by the events of this trilogy, which would also fit perfectly in the timeline as a key moment for the New Republic era, as well as to hint as to what's to come by the time of The Force Awakens. I wanted to talk about the Thrawn trilogy, one, because I reread the books and honestly we're pretty captivated by them. Two, because although they are ultimately drastically different, I do feel like there are some similarities between both trilogies that ultimately isn't talked about enough. And three, to prove all of the people in the comments that are always like, actually, I feel like he hasn't read any Legends books before. Yeah, I was getting tired of it, so Call me crazy, but I wanted to prove those people wrong. Whether you prefer one trilogy or the other, I think it's safe to say that both have absolutely had a significant impact on Star Wars as a series, and have inspired numerous artists, authors, and other creatives to tell even more stories set within a galaxy far, far away. The Thrawn trilogy wasn't just the answer to a lot of fans' questions for many years, it was actually the defining start to the Star Wars expanded universe, upping the standards to the types of stories that really could be told through books, comics, games, and more, including massive multimedia projects like Shadows of the Empire in 1996, but that's another story for another time. I know that a lot of people get up in arms and are extremely defensive over the Star Wars projects that they enjoy over other projects. One of Star Wars' biggest strengths is just how limitless and imaginative it feels. It's a galaxy of endless possibilities, and the fact that we have two distinct timelines, canon and legends, makes it feel even more expansive. Or at least, that's just how I see it. So do I recommend reading the Thrawn trilogy in 2024 and beyond? Honestly, absolutely. Whether you're a fan or not of the new projects, it's a great look back at 90s Star Wars, even before the prequels, and you'll probably enjoy, or at the very least appreciate, this alternate telling of what comes after Return of the Jedi, as well as will most likely open the door to exploring future stories set within the expanded universe. I feel like a lot of EU fans act like their stories were abandoned and wiped off the face of the earth, but that's really not the case at all. If there's one thing that I feel like Disney has done extremely well with Star Wars as a brand, it's still making stories prior to their acquisition of the IP extremely accessible. You can still find a massive variety of Legends books right alongside new canon books at almost every major bookstore and even online. They're also still making action figures off the Thrawn trilogy and other EU projects, so that's pretty cool too. Timothy Zahn himself even came back to write 2 more separate Thrawn trilogies to fit within the new timeline. Needless to say, it's definitely worth your time, especially since a lot of elements from these books have been reintroduced into the new canon. But what do you think of the Thrawn trilogy? Do you love it? Are you not a fan? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you do enjoy talking about Star Wars, I have a link to my Discord server down in the description below. That all being said, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, and if you want to watch more, I have plenty more videos on my channel. Until next time, may the Force be with you.